The sound that made everyone turn wasn't loud, but it was final, like something in a life quietly breaking beyond repair. Emily Carter didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even look back as she steadied herself against the cold marble railing, one hand instinctively resting over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy, her breath shallow, controlled, deliberate, because in that moment she understood something most people never do. This wasn't an accident, and nothing in her life had been for a very long time. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change her life. It unraveled a millionaire's world piece by piece. Just 6 months earlier, Emily had been the kind of woman people admired without questioning, the quiet wife of Daniel Whitmore, a self-made millionaire whose name carried weight in every room he entered, a man who built companies, closed deals in glass offices overlooking Manhattan, and spoke in numbers that most people couldn't even comprehend. But behind closed doors, behind the polished image and tailored suits, there were silences that stretched too long, conversations that never happened, and a distance that no amount of luxury could disguise. Emily had once believed in him completely, believed in the late nights, the business trips, the unexplained absences, because love, real love, trains you to trust before it teaches you to doubt. But trust has a breaking point, and hers came quietly, not with a confrontation, not with a confession, but with a message that wasn't meant for her, a name that didn't belong in her husband's world, and a realization that settled into her chest like something cold and immovable. Daniel didn't deny it when she finally asked, didn't apologize either, just adjusted his cufflinks as if the conversation were an inconvenience, as if her voice, her presence, her entire existence had become something secondary, something optional, and that was the moment everything shifted, though not in the way he expected. Because Emily didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't fall apart the way stories say women do. She went quiet, and in that silence, something stronger than anger began to take shape. What Daniel didn't know, what no one knew, was that Emily Carter had spent years learning how to survive in a world that underestimated her, years watching, listening, remembering details that didn't seem important at the time, details that would soon become something else entirely. And then came the night that changed everything. The moment people would later replay in whispers, the moment that would be described in headlines and courtroom testimonies, though none of them would fully capture what it felt like to stand there, to feel the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than anything physical ever could. The room had been filled with people, colleagues, investors, strangers who admired Daniel's success, who saw only what he allowed them to see. And Emily stood among them like a ghost in her own life, invisible until she wasn't, until a single moment shifted every pair of eyes toward her, until silence spread across the room like a ripple no one could stop. And in that silence, in that suspended second where everything hung in place, Emily realized something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what he was about to lose. Because some men believe power protects them, believe money rewrites consequences, believe silence equals control, but they forget one thing. Truth doesn't disappear, it waits. And Emily Carter was done waiting. By the time the room found its voice again, Daniel Whitmore was already smiling, the kind of controlled, practiced smile that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations, the kind that told everyone nothing was wrong even when everything was. And for a moment, people believed it, because they wanted to, because it was easier to trust confidence than to question it. But Emily did not move, did not respond, did not play her part in the illusion he had spent years perfecting, and that was the first crack anyone could actually see. There had always been rules in Daniel's world, unspoken but understood, rules about appearances, about what was said and what was never acknowledged, about how problems were handled quietly behind closed doors where they could not affect the brand, the reputation, the empire he had built. From nothing, and Emily had followed those rules once, had lived inside them, had convinced herself that silence was strength, that patience was loyalty, that love meant enduring what others could not see, but standing there under the soft glow of chandelier light, surrounded by people who only knew the version of her that Daniel allowed. She realized those rules had never been designed to protect her, only to protect him. Across the room, a woman laughed, soft and polished, the kind of laugh that belonged in spaces like this. And Emily did not need to turn her head to know who it was. because she had memorized that voice weeks ago, late at night, through a recording she had never intended to hear, a moment that had replayed itself over and over until it stopped hurting and started clarifying. And when Emily finally did look, her eyes steady, her posture calm, there was no shock left in her expression, only recognition. Vanessa Clark stood beside Daniel now, close enough to be noticed, far enough to pretend innocence, dressed in a way that commanded attention without asking for it. Her presence seamless in a world built on status and perception, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between the two women, not anger, not jealousy, but understanding, because Vanessa had underestimated her, and Emily knew it. Someone said Emily's name then, uncertain, cautious, as if testing whether she would respond, whether she would retreat back into the role she had always played, but she did not turn toward them, did not offer reassurance, because reassurance was no longer her responsibility. Instead, she reached for the small object resting in her purse, something simple, something ordinary, yet something that had taken weeks to decide to use, weeks of quiet observation, of connecting details that did not make sense until they did, and when her fingers closed around it, her pulse slowed, not with fear, but with certainty. Daniel noticed then, really noticed, the stillness in her, the absence of reaction that he had always relied on to maintain control, and his smile faltered, just slightly, just enough for those closest to him to catch it, and that was all it took, because power is fragile when it depends on perception, and perception shifts faster than truth ever needs to. He took a step toward her, measured, careful, as if approaching a situation he could still manage, still redirect, his voice low when he spoke, controlled but edged with something new, something less certain, asking her what she was doing in a tone that suggested the answer mattered more than the question itself. And Emily finally looked at him fully, not as his wife, not as the woman who had stood beside him for years, but as someone seeing him clearly for the first time, and in that gaze, there was no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet resolve that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Because what Daniel still did not understand, what no one in that room understood yet, was that Emily Carter had already made her decision long before this night, long before this moment, and everything happening now was not the beginning of something falling apart. It was the beginning of something being revealed. Daniel Whitmore had built his entire life on timing, on knowing exactly when to speak, when to move, when to apply pressure, and when to step back. But as he stood there watching Emily, he realized for the first time that he no longer controlled the pace of what was happening, and that realization settled in slowly, like something unwelcome but undeniable, because the woman in front of him was no longer reacting to him. She was moving independently of him, and that changed everything. The room felt different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with attention, because people were watching, not openly, not yet, but subtly. The way people observe something they do not fully understand but know is important, and in a world like this, attention was currency, and Daniel could feel it shifting. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the object in her hand, and for a brief moment, she remembered the first time she had considered this path, sitting alone in their home, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows, realizing that the life she had built was not what it seemed, that the man she had trusted had been living a parallel story she was never meant to see. And in that moment, she had a choice, to confront him immediately and risk being dismissed, or to wait, to learn, to understand the full picture before saying a single word, and she chose to wait. That decision had not been easy. It required patience, restraint, and a kind of emotional discipline most people never develop. But it gave her something far more valuable than immediate answers. It gave her clarity, and clarity does not rush. It builds, piece by piece, until the truth is no longer something you question, but something you know. Daniel took another step closer, lowering his voice further, asking her again what she was doing, this time with less confidence and more urgency, because he could feel control slipping in a way he had never experienced before. And Emily finally responded, her voice calm, steady, almost quiet, but clear enough that the few people nearest to them could hear every word. And that was enough, because in rooms like this, information does not need to be loud to travel. It only needs to be interesting. She told him she had waited longer than she should have, that she had given him more chances than he ever deserved, and that she had spent months understanding something he thought he had hidden perfectly. And as she spoke, Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for the entire room to notice, but enough for those closest to see the shift, the moment where certainty gave way to doubt. Across the room, Vanessa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, her confidence faltering just slightly as she watched the exchange unfold, because whatever this was, it was no longer predictable, and unpredictability is the one thing people like her cannot easily navigate. Emily took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the transition, because this was the moment where everything she had held back would finally move forward, and timing, she had learned, was not about speed, it was about precision. She glanced down briefly at what she held, then back at Daniel, meeting his eyes without hesitation, and in that look was something he had never seen from her before. Not anger, not pain, but finality, the kind that does not ask for permission and does not offer a second chance. Because what Daniel still believed was that this could be contained, that whatever Emily thought she knew could be managed, redirected, negotiated away like every other problem he had ever faced. But what he failed to understand was that some truths do not negotiate, and some decisions, once made, do not reverse, and Emily Carter had already crossed that line long before this night ever began. There is a moment, just before everything changes, when the air feels heavier, when conversations slow without anyone realizing why. And in that moment, Emily Carter moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that drew attention without demanding it, her hand lifting slightly, revealing at last the small device she had been holding all along, a simple phone, nothing remarkable on its own, yet in the right moment, in the right hands, it carried more weight than any speech Daniel Whitmore could deliver. He saw it instantly, and something in his expression tightened, not fear, not yet, but recognition, because he understood leverage, he understood information, and he understood when a situation was no longer within his control. Emily did not raise her voice, did not gesture for attention. She simply spoke, and the quiet clarity of her tone carried further than any shout ever could. She said that she had spent months listening, learning, verifying, making sure that what she knew was not assumption but fact, and that she had given him every opportunity to be honest before choosing this moment instead. A few people nearby turned fully now, drawn in by the shift in energy, by the unmistakable sense that something real was unfolding in a room built on appearances, and in that shift, the balance changed. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice further, asking her to stop, to take this conversation somewhere private, his words measured but urgent, the first clear sign that this was no longer a situation he could manage publicly, and Emily almost smiled, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition, because privacy had always been his shield, the place where truth could be reshaped, minimized, explained away, but tonight, there would be no closed doors. She told him that private conversations were over, that silence had already lasted too long, and that what happened next would not be controlled by him. And with that, she pressed a single button. The sound that followed was not loud, not disruptive, but it cut through the room with absolute clarity, a recorded voice, unmistakable, familiar to anyone who knew Daniel even casually, speaking words that did not belong in a carefully constructed image, words that revealed intentions, decisions, conversations that had never been meant to surface. And for a second, no one moved. It was not the content alone that held them there. It was the contrast, the difference between the man they thought they knew and the version now unfolding in front of them, because nothing breaks perception faster than undeniable evidence. Vanessa's composure shifted first, subtle but visible, her posture tightening, her gaze flickering between Daniel and the phone as if calculating, as if searching for an angle that no longer existed, and Daniel, for the first time that night, did not have an immediate response, his silence louder than anything he could have said. Emily did not rush, did not escalate. She simply let the moment exist, let the room absorb what it was hearing, because she understood something he never expected her to understand, that truth does not need to be forced, it only needs to be revealed at the right time. One voice became several as whispers began to spread, quiet at first, then building, questions forming without being asked directly, judgments forming without needing confirmation, And in a world that thrived on perception, that shift was irreversible. Daniel finally spoke again, attempting to explain, to redirect, to reframe what people were hearing, but his words lacked the certainty they once carried, because certainty depends on control, and control had already slipped away. Emily met his gaze one last time, steady, composed, and in that moment there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to salvage, because what he was losing now was not just reputation or influence. It was something far more fundamental, something he had underestimated from the very beginning, the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen to stop being silent. The first reaction was not outrage, not confrontation, but silence, the kind that spreads slowly as people begin to process something they cannot immediately dismiss. And in that silence, Emily Carter stood completely still, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment everyone else was still trying to understand. Around her, the room shifted in subtle ways. Conversations that had once filled the space now reduced to whispers. Glances exchanged between people who had built their lives on instinct and perception. People who understood that what they had just heard could not be easily explained away, no matter how powerful the man at the center of it all had once seemed. Daniel Whitmore tried again, his voice measured but strained, attempting to reframe what had just been revealed, calling it a misunderstanding, a fragment taken out of context, a narrative that did not reflect the full truth. But his words landed differently now, not with authority, but with hesitation, because once doubt enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly. Emily did not interrupt him, did not argue. She simply let him speak, because she knew something he was only beginning to realize, that explanation without trust is just noise, and trust, once broken publicly, does not return on command. Across the room, Vanessa Clark shifted her weight, her composure no longer effortless, her gaze sharper now, more calculating, as if she were reassessing everything in real time, understanding that proximity to power only matters when that power remains intact. And for the first time since she entered that room, there was distance between her and Daniel, not physical, but unmistakable. Emily noticed it, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because she had spent months studying dynamics like this, observing how quickly alliances could change when the foundation beneath them started to crack. A man near the bar stepped away, quietly, as if distancing himself from something he did not want to be associated with. A woman beside him followed, her expression neutral but her decision clear, and these small movements, barely noticeable on their own, began to accumulate, forming a pattern that Daniel could no longer ignore. He looked at Emily again, this time not as someone he could manage, but as someone he had underestimated, and that realization settled in with a weight that no amount of confidence could lift. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach those who were still listening, and she said that what they had heard was only a fraction, that there were details, records, and timelines that completed the picture, that she had not come here to create a scene, but to end a silence that had gone on far too long, and in doing so, she made it clear that this moment was not impulsive, not emotional, but intentional. Daniel's response came slower now, less certain, asking her what she wanted, as if this could still be negotiated, as if outcomes could still be shaped through the same strategies that had worked for him in every other situation. But Emily did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something he could offer, it was something that had already been decided. She looked around the room briefly, taking in the faces, the reactions, the shifting energy, and then back at him, her expression unchanged, and in that moment, it became clear that this was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing what had already been proven. Because what Daniel Whitmore was losing now was not just control over a situation, it was control over how he was seen, and in a world built on perception, that loss was permanent. Daniel Whitmore had always believed that recovery was simply a matter of strategy, that any setback could be managed with the right words, the right timing, the right pressure applied in the right place. But as he stood there watching the room slowly shift away from him, he realized something that no amount of experience had prepared him for, that some situations do not recover, they conclude. The distance between him and the people around him was no longer subtle, it was visible now, measured not in steps but in attention, in the way conversations resumed without including him, in the way eyes that once followed him with admiration now avoided him entirely. And in a world built on influence, being ignored was more damaging than being challenged. Emily Carter did not move to fill the silence, did not press further, because she understood that the moment had already passed the point where effort was required. And effort, she had learned, is only necessary when truth is uncertain. She adjusted her posture slightly, one hand still resting protectively over her pregnancy, grounding herself not in the room, but in something far more important than anything happening around her. And that quiet gesture carried more meaning than anything she could have said. Daniel noticed it, and for the first time that night, his focus shifted away from control and toward consequence, because he began to understand that this was not just about him, not just about reputation or business or perception, but about something he had treated as secondary for far too long. He tried once more, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence that had defined it earlier, asking her what she wanted in a way that was no longer strategic, but uncertain, as if the answer might still offer him a path forward. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, and when she spoke, her words were simple, direct, and impossible to reinterpret. She said that this was not about what she wanted anymore. It was about what she would no longer accept. That distinction settled in slowly, but its impact was immediate, because it removed the possibility of negotiation entirely. Vanessa Clark, who had remained silent until now, took a small step back, her posture no longer aligned with Daniel's, her expression composed but distant, and in that single movement, the final layer of illusion dissolved, because alignment in spaces like this is never accidental, and neither is separation. Emily noticed, not with triumph, but with understanding, because she had seen this pattern before, in smaller ways, in quieter moments, and now she was watching it unfold fully, without resistance. A few people began to leave, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, the kind of exit that signals a decision rather than a reaction, and with each departure, the space around Daniel grew wider, emptier, more exposed. He looked around, taking in the subtle shifts, the absence of support where he had always expected it, and for the first time, he did not try to stop it, because somewhere in that realization, he understood that this was no longer something he could control, only something he had to face. Emily turned slightly then, not away from him, but away from the center of the room, as if repositioning herself not as part of the situation, but outside of it, and in that movement, there was a quiet finality that required no announcement. Because what had happened here was not a confrontation, not an argument, not even a scandal in the way people might later describe it. It was a shift, a clear, irreversible shift in power, in perception, and in truth, and once that shift occurs, nothing returns to what it was before. Emily Carter did not rush to leave, and that was the part no one expected, because most people, after a moment like that, would have walked away quickly, eager to escape the weight of what had just happened. But Emily remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, her expression calm, as if she understood that the final moments of something are just as important as the beginning. The room had thinned now, not empty, but changed. The energy no longer centered around Daniel Whitmore, but scattered, uncertain, recalibrating in real time. And in that shift, something deeper became visible, not just the collapse of perception, but the quiet rearrangement of loyalty. Daniel stood still, his posture no longer commanding but rigid, as if holding himself in place required effort, his eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in the absence of support, the subtle withdrawal of people who had once aligned themselves with him without hesitation. And in that realization, something inside him seemed to settle, not into acceptance, but into awareness. Emily watched him for a moment, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a kind of distance that only comes when a decision has already been made and fully accepted, because she was no longer reacting to him. She was simply observing the consequences unfold. The phone in her hand lowered slightly, no longer needed, its purpose fulfilled, and she placed it back into her purse with the same deliberate calm she had carried throughout the night, a small, quiet action that marked the closing of something far larger. Daniel spoke again, but this time his voice did not carry, not because it was softer, but because it no longer held the room, and that difference was unmistakable, the way authority dissolves when belief in it disappears. He said her name, not as a command, not as a question, but as something else entirely, something closer to recognition, as if he were finally seeing the full weight of who she was beyond the role he had assigned to her for so long. Emily paused, just slightly, acknowledging the moment without turning back fully, and in that pause there was a quiet acknowledgement, not of him, but of everything that had led to this point. She did not offer explanation, did not revisit what had already been revealed, because there was nothing left to clarify, and clarity, once reached, does not require repetition. Vanessa Clark had already stepped away entirely now, her distance no longer subtle, her attention redirected, her presence no longer tied to Daniel in any visible way, and that separation spoke louder than any statement she could have made, because in environments like this, alignment is always intentional, and so is withdrawal. A few remaining guests exchanged brief glances, then returned to their conversations, quieter now, more measured, as if adjusting to a new understanding that had settled over the room, and with each passing second, Daniel became less central, less relevant to the space he once dominated so completely. Emily finally turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm certainty that required no announcement, and began to walk toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying her further away from a version of her life that no longer existed. She did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention, nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved. Because what had happened here was not just exposure, not just the end of a deception, it was the completion of a transformation, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible, and as the doors closed behind her, the only thing left in that room was the echo of a truth that could not be undone. The night air outside felt different, not colder, not warmer, but clearer, as if the weight of everything that had just happened had remained behind those closed doors, and Emily Carter paused for a brief moment at the edge of the sidewalk, her hand resting lightly over her pregnancy, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to brace for. Behind her, through the tall glass windows, the room still moved, still functioned, people returning to conversations, to drinks, to the quiet rituals of a world that never fully stops, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be repaired with time or explanation, and Emily knew that without needing to look back. She stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, grounded, not rushed by emotion or urgency, but guided by something far more stable, something she had built quietly over months of patience and observation, a certainty that did not require validation from anyone else. A car passed along the street, headlights stretching briefly across the pavement, and in that passing light, Emily caught a reflection of herself in the glass beside the entrance, a reflection that looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, because she was no longer the version of herself that had walked into that building earlier that evening. She was something else now, something defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to do in response. Her phone remained silent in her purse, no messages, no calls, no immediate aftermath chasing her into the night, and that silence felt earned, not empty, because she understood that whatever would follow would take time, conversations behind closed doors, decisions made in offices and boardrooms, narratives shifting quietly in spaces she no longer needed to enter. Daniel Whitmore's world would not collapse overnight, not in the dramatic way people imagine, but it would change, piece by piece, in the same slow, deliberate way Emily had built her understanding, and that kind of change is the kind that lasts. She reached the curb and paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, taking in the city around her, the movement, the noise, the rhythm that continued regardless of what had just ended behind her. And in that realization, there was something grounding, something steady, because life does not pause for any one moment, no matter how significant it feels. A black sedan pulled up quietly, the driver stepping out to open the door with a simple nod, a gesture that carried no questions, no curiosity, just acknowledgement, and Emily accepted it with the same calm she had carried all night, stepping inside without looking back, not because she was avoiding the past, but because she had already faced it fully. As the car moved forward, merging into the steady flow of traffic, the building behind her grew smaller, less defined, until it became just another part of the city skyline, indistinguishable from everything else. And that was the final shift, the moment where something that once defined her no longer held that power. She leaned back slightly, her gaze steady through the window, the city lights reflecting softly across the glass, and for the first time, there was space, not just around her, but within her, space where doubt had once lived, space where silence had once been necessary. Because what Emily Carter understood now, with absolute clarity, was that strength is not always loud, not always visible in the moment it is forming, but when it finally reveals itself, it does not ask for permission, and it does not leave room for anything that no longer belongs. The city did not ask questions, and that was what Emily Carter noticed first as the car moved through the late evening traffic. Lights shifting from red to green in steady rhythm, pedestrians crossing streets without knowing anything about the quiet ending that had just taken place a few blocks behind. Because the world does not pause for personal revelations, it simply continues. And in that continuation, there is a kind of truth that cannot be ignored. She rested her head slightly against the seat, not in exhaustion, but in reflection, her hand still placed over her pregnancy in a gesture that had become instinct rather than thought. And for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened, not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the finality of it, the understanding that something long unresolved had now reached its conclusion. Across the city, in offices where decisions were made behind glass walls and quiet conversations shaped reputations, the shift had already begun, not loudly, not publicly, but in the way information travels among people who know how to listen, in the way trust recalibrates when new facts come into focus. And Daniel Whitmore, whether he realized it yet or not, was already part of a different conversation than the one he had controlled for years. Emily did not need to witness it, did not need confirmation, because she understood the pattern, understood that consequences in that world do not arrive all at once. They arrive in stages, measured, deliberate, and irreversible. The driver kept his eyes on the road, saying nothing, offering nothing beyond quiet professionalism. And Emily appreciated that, because tonight was not about being comforted, it was about being clear, and clarity does not require reassurance. She thought briefly about the months that had led here, the nights spent reviewing details, the moments of doubt that she had chosen to move through instead of retreat from, and she realized that the hardest part had not been the truth itself, but the decision to face it fully, without minimizing it, without explaining it away, without allowing it to become something smaller than it was. That decision had changed everything long before she ever stepped into that room. The car turned onto a quieter street now, the noise of the city softening, the lights less intense. And in that transition, there was a subtle shift in pace, a slowing that matched her own internal state, not rushed, not reactive, simply moving forward. She looked out the window again, watching the reflections pass by, buildings blending into one another, each one holding lives, stories, decisions that would never intersect with hers. And that distance felt grounding rather than isolating, because it reminded her that her life was no longer confined to a single narrative, a single role, a single expectation. When the car finally came to a stop, the engine settling into silence, Emily did not move immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, marked the beginning of something entirely new. She stepped out slowly, the air still, the street calm, and as the door closed behind her, there was no dramatic ending, no final declaration, just a quiet certainty that required nothing more. Because some men lose everything they have built in a single night, not because someone takes it from them, but because they fail to recognize the value of what they were given, and by the time they understand it, the only thing left is the truth they can no longer change.